been just kind of enjoying my day and just kind of relaxing a little bit. Sitting outside enjoying the springtime. I have some notes and just kind of reflecting on a variety of topics that I want to do and work on. But I'm thinking about this. So I make these certain references, right, when I'm involved in some commentary online. And I'm aware that some people might not know what those mean or what the references of those are. And so I do try to, like in some of my videos, draw pictures. I mean, it's funny how, because some of the pictures are so funny and not very well. And just some of it could be way better, but it's just a trade of ideas, and it's just like kind of the process of theory oriented note taking and research, where you're just trying, you're getting into a mode and you jot down an idea. And so I have done that. So in the past, when I would introduce ideas, I would draw out a picture, give imagery so people understand what I'm kind of referring to. So I was thinking about doing that. I was thinking about trying to unpack that and maybe sketch out an imagery where I was kind of relaying this to somebody else, kind of trying to articulate it. And I was doing it in such a way, through a format where I don't have to be too cautious about what I say, because I'm not expecting it to be public content for the most part. Not official public content, even though some stuff online, people could share access or, whatever. But, I kind of just like the rough notes of sharing an idea. And I was kind of explaining to them, I'm literally sitting out in kind of a picnic table vibes outside. And so if there's little sound effects or whatnot. I was thinking, would it be useful for me to try to explain how, when I talk about the system and I'm making reference to Netanyahu or various ones, or some of these influencers that kind of get paid through certain sources or influences of Israel tied to a type of Netanyahu type approach, and trying to differentiate some stuff. And so I was thinking, should I try to draw imagery about how intertwined and confusing that is to people to discern between or differentiate? Because there's some of these characters that they're kind of given space to be deceptive, whether it be kind of crowd capture or misuse of certain references, and it kind of keeps the false system going. And so that's what I was trying to work through. I was trying to articulate, which actually in nature there are portions of that, right? So even biologically, people will say, and actually Richard Dawkins and Alex O'Connor had a conversation about this. They were talking about, I forget the exact way that they phrased it. It wasn't exactly to this point, but they're talking about the mimicry, or mimicking, or I think what they were saying was memes, certain memes, in nature there's functional memes. There's also in nature different types of versions of parasites or survival oriented false perception and stuff like that. And so there's these other ways that organisms can function through a likeness of something else. and it keeps them alive, and they pretend to keep the host alive, that type of thing. So it's just kind of an interesting aspect of things. And so it's a little bit like that. Like, how do you discern between the deception? How do you discern between like the false references where it just seems like so similar, and it seems to speak the words of like preserving and absorbing the components and whatnot, but it's all still feeding the false imagery. So this is kind of what I was talking about in terms of what I was referencing as like Netanyahu and various ones and different ones that their platform and their influence serves functions through a type of like what I call like on the culmination of the world stage. It, at least if you're looking through scripture and whatnot, it culminates into like a world network. There's the world network power, and that's what they call Babylon. And it's described as like deceiving the nations, right? What's interesting about even the use of deceiving the nations is that it does kind of have a connotation of a type of Israel, because the name Jacob is in reference to like the one that grabs the heel, or like the one that like I'd have to look at the scripture. It says something like like deceives. A little interruption there. We have like a local fire department meeting, and so there was like a little alarm. Had to pause for a second. But so when you get that imagery, and it's kind of making reference to deception. So even like with Jacob, even though Jacob represents what eventually he enters into the struggle with God, and then he ends up being named Israel. The name Jacob, before he changes that to that name, has something to do with like to deceive and whatnot. And so what's interesting is that there's almost this connotation that there would be a network deceiving the world through like a false, improper use of Israel. What's interesting too is because when the book of Revelation, when it makes reference to Babylon and the great city, like the great world power, it is at a time when the Jewish movement that was functioning through a spiritual freedom was countering some of the supposed versions of Israel and interpreting what that would look like. And so there was kind of a confrontation of that. So it could be that they wrote the language because that was their area of conflict, as also connected to the world network system. But anyway, what I was getting to and why, I was trying to like carefully introduce the ideas is because it should be pretty obvious that the way I interpret some of it is like, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm not anti-Jewish. I'm trying to use the scripture to show how the story does seem to suppose to point toward these like greater steps of freedom, and that in following through with that, it should seem pretty obvious that there's a stage where Israel should not be misusing the world network among infiltrations of this, like what they would call like the Babylon power. And the Babylon power, then when you start seeing like connotations of it in the book of Revelation and other places, is that it is making reference that, because at the time people might say, why does it even refer to Babylon? Because Babylon wasn't even technically in the picture at that time. It had already gone through Nebuchadnezzar at Babylon, the height of the world, benchmarking it as like the height of the world. And then it had gone through like the Medes and the Persians, and like Alexander and the Greeks and the Romans and whatnot. And so why call it the Babylonian power? And the reasoning for that seems to be because it's making reference to this distinction that happened started, like this power transition happened way back when, like a whole different like reference point happened at that time where the remnant of Israel through the line of Judah was absorbed into, or like not just the line of Judah, but those that had allied with that side, because at that time the divided Israel became interpreted as these sides, the north and the south. It wasn't, so even when they say like Judah, it's not just Judah. There were other groups like that allied with them, and there was also just eventually some scattered and whatnot. And so you're getting to the point where right now the remnant is just now through this certain remnant of, and like through Judah. It's through those stories as to why they expect the like there's other reasonings, but in general, why they expect the reemergence of the whole kingdom and the whole, like, you know, there's different interpretations, but not necessarily the whole kingdom in the sense of like every exact tribe, because things had shifted at that point. But why they think it'll reemerge through the line of Judah and David and reemerge into this like kingdom influence. And so that's kind of what they're expecting. But this is why it's like such a transition when Jesus through the line of Judah and all the benchmarks that should be able to like check off some of those expectations seems like, for some people will say like legitimate, and then some will say but it didn't amount to what we thought it would. So this is where it kind of transitions between these different world views, these different like kingdom dominion views. But as I was saying, like when it goes back to the stage of Babylon, it's making reference to that benchmark, that stage of like that distinction where there's no longer the kingdom and it's fully absorbed into another kingdom, and then it has to function through those kingdoms, and then over time it like functions in this like integrated relationship through those kingdoms, to the point where when Jesus is calling that out, he's kind of saying it's like nearly inseparable. Like there's such a relationship that's been built and merged through the two. And so that's kind of like the time when he says like basically there's infiltration of like the market into this, like it functions through the market. There's just all of these other things, right? But anyway, what it seems to culminate into and why it carries through to the book of Revelation is because they're making reference to the struggle of this like spiritual movement functioning in this other, like through the stage of Jesus. He aligns it, as I kind of unpacked in the story about the resurrection in that 3-part recording. He aligns it to the kingdom that is not of this world. So he basically takes that expectation through the line of Judah, through the ties of David, from the breakout of Babylon, from like fulfilling the portions to free it to go unto all the worlds and whatnot. And he connects it to the dominion of the kingdom of God. And so once it gets to that point, there's these two functions where there's the dominion of Babylon, which is the ties infiltrated and connected to the world. And then there's the dominion of this new renewed kingdom on earth, which its headquarters are in the heavens. It's not, and so that's where you get this language where Jesus says, like, my kingdom is not of this world, and I'll be seated at the right hand of God in the heavens, which is a reference in those days that people would make unto kings and where their dominion is from. And they would say, like, this is my son, he sits next to me, he's in my dominion. You would even hear some of the other, like, quote-unquote worldly god kings say stuff like that. And so when Jesus is saying that, but he's and then Peter and them are testifying and saying, like, we didn't really know what he was up to, but we had this spiritual experience on the mountain where God revealed to all of us that this was his son, and then like, this is my son. And some people can say, does he literally mean it's his son and all of those things? But that's the language of dominion. So the way that if God is saying, this is my son, and there's other versions, like other portions of that go along with what was said there, but it's saying that he's concurring that he's of my kingdom. This is probably also a connotation to when it says in Islam, there's a certain reference where they're discerning between, and it could be that some of the revelations through Islam, they don't really fully know. They could have just been having these like spiritual, like, sometimes saying stuff that there's a partial present value to it, but then the seed of it is like speaking into something else. But there's this reference within Islam where it says something like the sons of Ezra. And it doesn't mean like, it could mean something else. I don't want to put too much on this, but what's interesting about that is Jesus even seems to make a reference to a type of like the sons. So there's this, like, I don't want to go into the whole story, but there's this interaction that Jesus has when he's with Peter. And some of the religious establishment are trying to entrap Jesus. And so he says something like, who do they collect taxes from? The kings or their sons. And then Peter says, like, from their sons. And then Jesus says, well, then we're exempt. But so we don't offend them, we'll just pay it. When you look into that, there's like a whole study. I've talked about that before. There's this whole study about that and what it refers to. And he's making reference to this like symbolism of the kings and their sons. In so many words, it's as though Jesus seems to be alluding to how the establishment had become basically like the sons of the world king. So there's the world dominion and then their sons. And so they've kind of become like a part of that dominion. And then Jesus is even kind of saying like, even we are like saying that to like Jesus and Peter, as saying we've become basically like the sons of the kings, in reference to like tribal lineage and whatnot, but not necessarily spiritually. Because as even some Jewish groups will say, like certain tribal lineage would go through the fathers in terms of like the land inheritances, but like the spiritual progression of things would like go through the mother. And it's kind of as though at that time when there was still a type of like the merging of the tribal lineage and the spiritual lineage, that he was saying along those lines, like it causes us to be tied to the kings, because we've also put in like the temple tax and all of these things have intertwined the land and the like world dominion. And so there's just a lot more that goes into that, but there is really like this whole notion of the kings and their sons. To go back to the reference within Islam, and I'm not saying that this exactly is it, but it does it's like a little reminiscent of it though, is because the actual study of following through in scripture, when Jesus is talking about the kings and their sons, goes back to the book of Ezra. And in the book of Ezra, that's when they merged the alliance between the Medes and the Persians, and them helping establish the rebuilding of the temple and like under the law of Moses and whatnot. And they merged the relationship between the world kings and the sons through this type of it initiates at that time through the reading of Ezra, is through the taxes and the sharing of the vision of like mutual benefit. So there becomes this like mutual benefit that then serves the kingdoms, but ultimately also serves Israel, the remnant of Israel at that time. And that's the language and the theme of the kings and their sons, like in Ezra. And so it is kind of interesting. So it eventually becomes a connotation through the stage of Jesus of the world powers and the connection of Israel, and then this alternative movement through this lineage of Jesus. And that's why it's important to understand that. So going back to like the stage of the shift of Jesus is, in some ways, Jesus And so this is kind of what's interesting, and I'm just kind of thinking about this. I'm not really stuck on this idea, but I'm thinking about it, is that there's this type of, like, almost like a bridge between Jesus through this last, like, land inheritance portion, where it does kind of justify this like connection between this world Babylonian power and this like heavenly kingdom that Jesus is like a resident of. And so it kind of takes portions of like that, the legalities of that land inheritance, and becomes a mechanism by which the blood accounts that had now become in the accounts of the Babylonian power are kind of like referenced unto forever being indebted, like through this whole switcheroo of things, to like never being able to account for this like heavenly dominion. So there's this whole, it's like a whole interesting storyline to where the Babylonian power can never really have like a claim against this like renewal of this kingdom, because it has allowed itself to be implicated in every standard would be used against itself and set in motion to erode. It's like a peculiar switcheroo of the story. But anyway, so this is where I'm kind of making reference, though, to this whole complicated story of like the Babylonian power as distinct from this other criteria that's kind of like being ushered in, and this claim to like diminish it and kind of like deconstruct it and like reconnect into this other life source, right? So you can kind of see the language of it. Anyway, though, what I was getting to was I was imagining how confusing it is for people when they're trying to discern between these different systems, and the language can get absorbed within this like Babylonian power. And so what it ends up seeming to be as you're reading the story is like the Babylonian power eventually reaches a point where it doesn't really have that power anymore. There is no claim of it being godlike. Its claims had been exposed. It doesn't have a claim anymore to like residing within through the God of Israel. If it does appeal to that, it has to go through this like direction of this, like, it has to cross through this mechanism as unto like the heavenly kingdom of God, which will actually continue to like deconstruct it. And then it can't really make a claim of legitimacy of historic wrongs and whatnot, because it has already set in motion this like ultimate counterbalance of those blood accounts. So it's just this whole thing. And so you start imagining, like in the story, you're seeing what's developing in the story is like the last eventual aspect that it has to try to appeal to these ideas is to create a mimic or a likeness, to falsely absorb these ideas and simply just to deceive people, to play along to the wrong thing. Which is interesting because it almost is like it refers back to the initial reveal of like the garden scene, right? Where there can't really be, like they kind of have to be tricked and fooled into doing the wrong, like doing something that sets in motion of like improper appeal and whatnot. And so it's interesting how it develops into this whole complex story about the only way to pretend to have power is to deceive people. And so you get this point in the story where it talks about in Revelation, there's this dominant world power that makes improper appeals to like Israel and improper appeals to like the blood accounts, and manufactures these like divisions because it can't ultimately really reclaim any of that in legitimacy. It's already set in motion to just be this ultimate like renewal of things. And so we get in the story where it just deceives people, and it tries to cause a lot of destruction. And eventually it's also trying to like stop people from having any type of like legitimate inheritance in this new kingdom. And so it has this language where it says like it tries to attack the saints, and those shifting things unto God. And so it like also just tries to formulate those attacks. Through doing that, it also woos people into like a false understanding, utilizing the language of like a Christ-likeness and all of this stuff. And so anyway, so I was thinking about that, and I was basically, so to summarize, I was saying this is like a long way to explain how there's these two competing powers, this world power system, which incorporates the market and ideas and utilizes false belief and false perception, all of these things, right? Manufactures like conflicts, tries to utilize like historic conflicts to manufacture a false sense of continuing in like a legitimacy of like the blood accounts, but it's not really functional because it's generating those. It's not a real balancing of things because it's already counterbalanced in the ultimate scheme of things. And so you get this story, right? And so then you have these two like dominions. You have this like dominion of life and restoration and transformative accounting for these things. And then you have this like deceptive Babylonian world power. So anyway, that's kind of like simplifying those like competing tensions there. So I was thinking to myself of like, should I draw that out, or how would I draw that out? Would I do like, so that's what I was like working through. I don't know now that I'll draw them out. Maybe I'll just utilize this as talking through it. But basically, if I were to maybe start in on attempting to draw it out, it would kind of portray something to the effect of like, maybe I would do like two frameworks. So there'd be this certain framework that would represent the Babylonian power and how it deceives and draws upon all these likenesses and whatnot, utilizes a certain world market, all of the things that are attributed to this like type of power, right? Misuses the language of Israel, deceives people. And then there's this other framework of this new kingdom, right? And it's not a closed framework because ultimately like there's an eternal value to it, but it's somewhat of a framework of this that represents like this transition of this system of life and whatnot. So I was thinking about that, and then I was imagining, then I'd have to portray and show like how it utilizes, like how it generates and functions, like how it creates its like sense of like currency and connection and network, and how it utilizes those networks to try to leverage against these other methods and this other way of developing this other spiritual unit or what have you. So I was thinking about that, but now I'm just kind of talking through it. And it kind of does account for how some people, like you'll even find in some of the atheist movements, and this isn't anything entirely against them. There's a lot of really good like helpful atheists and whatnot, and a lot of people legitimately trying to just be kind of agnostic and choose like the better options. And there's a lot of confusion, and there is a lot of like really warped interpretations of religion and whatnot. And so I'm just saying it's not to be against all atheists, whatnot, but you'll find some of the prominent atheists. This is why they could probably both argue a point for like where they seem to be arguing the same point as some religious groups, but they're trying to, like, they understand through the Babylonian power. They try to make sense of the Babylonian world network. They generally tend to gain success from participating and perpetuating the type of like world network in the same way, and why they can be situated right next to other influencers that are propping themselves up, using this Christian language, using these likenesses of God and whatnot. But then they're both very much situated in like the same system that is also a system that misuses the likeness of Israel and all of these things in the world market, and they benefit from it. And then how you can also see characters, say like Netanyahu or different ones, that they feel they don't, if they can keep people deflected into this system, they don't really feel threatened by the idea of like the misuse of like Christian language and interpretations, because it doesn't seem, as long as they can kind of keep deceiving people into participating in these other avenues of like benefit and generating this network. They don't feel threatened by other groups like saying those things. They can create a likeness of it, right? Whereas when they do feel threatened, almost every one of these characters is when people start connecting and resonating with what would be called like this spiritual movement, which has attributes like, even if people are agnostic, they're like, I don't know what it is, I'm not very spiritual, but something about this movement seems more legitimate. It seems like it's differentiating. It seems like an alternative, even though the language can sound similar, where they're creating like a network in the world or among the creation, and they kind of make references to God, but it just seems like they're using it in a different way, like in a different framework. And so you start finding, though, then when people are actually shifting, like some attributes of seeing them shifting is when they're starting to question this improper connection that Israel claims as this perpetual like Cyrus or Babylon negotiation, world network, alliance, adherence, and whatnot. And when you start questioning that and say, no, life is more free than that. Like, we're not at that stage in the story. So this is where it starts like surfacing and showing itself, where they feel threatened, where then they have people competing over these stories, and almost like a holy battle of language and interpretation, because it really does affect the way that they see the system that they're invested in. This is also where Netanyahu and different ones, you'll start to see them utilize the language to kind of defend their Babylonian power and say, like, if you actually went into this spiritual direction and you utilize language of Christ, like, there would be no power to it. Like, you would be like weakened, you would be. And so you kind of see it almost like a narcissistic person when someone's trying to like leave. Then you start seeing like, oh, they're not really nice and kind. Oh, they're not really like following in wherever revelation and spirit of life goes. They're actually utilizing this to deceive people, and they're actually very protective and defensive about it. So then becomes the question of, how do you like properly, in the spirit of like integrity, make those transitions, right? And so this is also where it's interesting, where Jesus kind of builds that bridge between the land inheritances and whatnot. But it doesn't point to the land inheritance reestablishing Israel in the same way through the Babylonian power. It actually incorporates some of the last remnants of it and situates it as a bridge between the previous state of the world, because there's so many people that still need to be freed from that, transitioned and shifted over, and that there's still hostile claims, and it acclimates it toward this like spiritual renewal. And so in some ways, in a spiritual sense, because Babylon and the world power infiltrated itself into this accounting, the standard of judgment is basically at the height of its wrong, and as it de-escalates, it still spiritually justifies other groups to like situate and transition over, as long as they're not fighting the wrong battle in the sense of this like Babylon-Israel connection in that sense. And so they can see that through the story, it's a pretty peculiar story, like they've gained access to being able to like both defend the de-escalating, make that transition, and usher in this new kingdom. And they don't have, they're not required to have to fight for these other previous battles. And so you'll see that's where some of the power struggle is like the groups want to deceive into continuing to fight that various battle. So along those lines, and also like unearthing and exposing, so I was thinking about, like drawing this imagery out. What would it look like with some of these other influencers that they're not necessarily the ones at the height of power, like in the sense of running the military or things like that. These other influencers and different ones that get these benefits to be a part of the market of Babylon and whatnot. And they also woo people into these connections through providing the language of Christianity and religion and success and a false type of saviorism through this system, right? And so you could say, like, how do you differentiate between that? For one, you could tell, though, when the going gets tough, they're not like they're functioning through the Babylonian system. They're utilizing the language through the error of like an improper stage of utilizing Israel to connect to Christianity, to connect to this world system. And you can tell that when people are actually interpreting things through the spiritual lens, it points to this other framework. And so they have to keep kind of deceiving that. They have to infiltrate the story and try to absorb the story and frame it as though like so they function through these other maneuvers of there's a lot to it actually, some of the mechanisms used, but to try to simplify it, they maneuver through situations and difficulties, and they make it directly difficult for people, and then they kind of pin groups against each other. They provoke tensions among groups, because if they don't really have a spiritual authority, if they're not really speaking in truth, they have to use deception to manipulate this framework so that they can appear to be speaking truth, but they're entrapping people and they're pinning people against each other, and then they're delivering a false savior as a message that ultimately keeps the message and the likenesses of like Christ and saving and success and all of these things to deflect away from the actual systemic connection to that, like systemic freedom of that. And they connect it to what keeps people occupied, that keeps people entrapped and whatnot. And so another way to maybe, if I were to possibly attempt an imagery of this, it would be maybe like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I know people have disagreements on Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how it's like drawn out and how life could actually be looked at differently. And there's actually some truth. There seems to be truth to that. Like if you were mapping out the needs in life and the unit of life, various tribes will say it looks different. Like if it was in the spiritual system, it would be arranged differently. It wouldn't be arranged as like a hierarchy that produces threat. But it's useful in the sense of the skewed system, because what it seems like is Maslow was trying to map out how vulnerabilities function. And so in some way, even if people could say it's like a skewed way of looking at things, because like I was saying, like some of the tribes like rearrange how a unit would work and it would function a little bit differently and wouldn't create through levels of success further vulnerability. It would create further relational value. So that's why some people have problems with like Maslow's layout, but it's useful to use it as a mapping out of what's functioning in the skewed system. So there is some truth to it, like mapping out the skewed system. So one of the things with Maslow's hierarchy of needs is that it's a pyramid, and he shows at the very base of it, like the very basic needs of people, physiological needs, basic needs, food, water, shelter, those things. And then I forget exactly what the buildup of it, but it's something to the effect of like, then people need a level of security and belonging and integration in a type of unit or community. And through there, then they're able to advance up to like the second half of the triangle, which is then other levels of like development. And then eventually at the height of it is like actualization, right? Where you portray a level of advancement and success in the system and whatnot. What you find with some of these influencers, the stage that they seem to be functioning at, which is like a functional form of a relationship with the skewed system, a system of control and a system of dominion, is that they exploit the whole bottom half. They exploit systems of like how they've initially generated like their foundation, and they are dishonest about how they've developed into those integrations and investments. So the very base by which they started on is like a misconstrued stage of development, which wouldn't track through relationally or anything like that. What you get with a lot of these various ones is like they can never really be transparent in the way that they've developed. It can't really be duplicated in a sense that's like freely given to other people and whatnot. They have to kind of, they function through the top half of the pyramid, which is the stage of like the haves or the investment or the perception. And then the investment and perception regenerate itself. And so because they do that, they function in a type of using the market and appearance and likeness and propaganda in conjunction with getting investments from the higher ups or those that like basically function to control the system. And they do that, and as they do that, they can control the whole bottom half in conjunction, in partnership with the system that gives them certain levels of investment. So basically it's kind of saying like a certain version of like a deceived top half of investment generates and keeps generating, and there's like a certain type of benefit that they get from each other, and they know that they don't have to be honest about the whole bottom half of like basic needs for people. So they basically participate in an occupying force over all of the like bottom half like life needs of people and mechanisms. And so there's a level of deception and dishonesty as to how they even got to that point. And so they are kind of then functionally in cahoots to like keep that deception going, because they haven't based or developed themselves on anything but those deceptions. Also seem to find with these types of like developments, even like throughout history, eventually when you get kingdoms that are functioning through occupying forces, you kind of map out what those forces are. It's also interesting that a lot of times when a system functions through deception and false likenesses, and there's like a distinction of like spiritual movement or like spiritual authority, almost every time there's a heightening of this surfacing of like a spiritual movement, because when you really break down the idea of like spirituality, there's a relational value there. There's like an internal connection that people develop, a network of humanity. There's like it taps into other forms of just simply how we are created to exist. And there's these other factors that there's just this organic connection of what people call spirituality. And so when there's these connections where these movements connect and move and shift and start reconciling things and having the fruit of these connections and like the body of humanity coming together, it starts to like threaten these dominions, right? Even if you look at it on a smaller scale, like a toxic relationship where somebody's dominating over somebody else, you could see that certain maneuvers and behaviors will come out. Certain likenesses and falseness will come out. And almost every time, like throughout history, there's this pivotal point of transition where a lot of times what ends up being co-opted, or like how would you say it, a method or a scheme that these partnerships on the world stage utilize is like this dominance, propaganda, lies, deception, marketing, like this whole network, right? But then you also see that in them infiltrating a competitiveness to both like absorb the language, absorb the storyline, absorb the testimonies, and deflect and keep pulling them into this false direction. They also end up platforming a type of like very sexualized behavior as a substitutionary animation to keep their system, their competing system going. And that sexualized behavior and animation becomes like the substitutionary animation to like their felt opposition to these other systems and movements that are more spiritually generated. So it becomes this kind of like battle between like a spiritually generated movement and then false animation manufacturing through the misuse of the network and a misuse of relationship and a misuse of like all these false imagery. And they try to solve for it as being this competition of God, but it's always like in this like same repetitive cycle of what they call the Babylonian power. So that's also interesting as well. What that doesn't mean though is that everything needs to be a witch hunt, or that any type of like sex like because they use, so it's actually a very it's a very confusing stage of things. And it's a difficult stage to confront, because when the system starts misusing sexual exploits and whatnot, other groups that try to counter it, they end up falling for its trap by improperly countering it. And then you create witch hunts, and then you create like degrading sexual freedoms. And so people, in a sense where they're legitimately zeroing in on, okay, they're misusing these measures and misusing these likenesses and these markets and these exploits and whatnot, people can kind of start noticing it. Like, they kind of get these hints of like, these people are like, what they're doing in this like marketing and all of this stuff, they use a lot of technicalities of like, we're not hurting anybody, we're not doing this, and we're not doing that. And so what's difficult about this stage of things is that you kind of have to like discern to like handle it properly, or you feed their lie. Like, they want you to improperly attack them. They want you to create these like certain witch hunts and whatnot, because their argument is that they're fighting the good fight. It fuels their sense of like a false saviorism. So it's also just kind of a peculiar stage of part of the like discerning battle, because you don't want to overcorrect. You do need stages of like acclimating the buildup of like developing actual relationships. There are certain levels of freedom that people have. You don't want to like try to counter it, even if you have good intentions, to preserve a type of religious like conviction by improperly countering it, and then it turns into these like it's a very deceptive stage of battle, right? And so what I was talking about in that sense was like you even find at the time of Jesus, there were all these just different types of where Jesus is also trying to like redirect the religious fervor, right? And so he's showing that you can build, like he's showing that you can discern between a freedom to have these certain relationships and connections. And so he's becoming accused by, like talking with like prostitutes and other people and different ones. But he's showing that you can properly start developing those relationships with people receptive to that type of change. And there were people that were receptive to that type of change. And it's as distinct from, say, like there could be other characters, right? So even in the story, it starts to discern between different type of characters that function in those types of like influences, because at the time there isn't the breakaway out from the Babylonian power, and so there's degrees of like inescapable results of like sexualized behavior and sexual exploits. And so there's like degrees of building improvement, while at the same time building confidence and relationships and truth and discernment as to like what's going on, and discernment as to like steps to like be free from the occupying forces and whatnot. So at the same time, you have other characters portraying these like sexual exploits and behaviors, and they're utilizing them in a different way. So it's kind of an example with like Herod's wife and the daughters and whatnot, where they're part of the establishment and they kind of have these deals and connections with those in the establishment, and they're directly opposed to this spiritual movement. And so they're different than, say, like those stuck in like some of the sex work because of the occupying forces and whatnot. Like there's a difference with these women that are in power misusing sexual exploits. And so it kind of talks about in the story where they have these ties and investments and whatnot, and they're offended by this system and this movement kind of calling them out for all their distortions. And so they pin people into they know how to pull the strings of like the banquet hall and the societal city square and the parties and whatnot, and they know how to use the sexual exploits to get favors. And so they utilize these sexual exploits to try to strategize keeping the system going and portions of the establishment, and they use it to attack people. They use it to go after people. They use it as a weaponized form of the market. You can't you know that when you hear this story, because they're doing these things and these sexual dances, and they're doing it so that they can get some of the people killed and whatnot. And so you don't see Jesus sitting and talking with them, or, so there's a difference. You can start seeing the distinction between these like anti-relational behaviors and whatnot, or these like survival behaviors. And Jesus even seems to be saying like you kind of have to discern between these things and not get caught up in like a religious fervor of like generalization. And so then what's interesting though is he doesn't directly attack some of the sexual exploits. He kind of names it as they're flowing into, like, if you really want to get to some of the root of it, they're flowing into the powers of these systems. These people that behave in these ways target the spiritual movement because they are benefiting from the powers. So if you actually want to follow it through and get to like where that distinction is, it's some of these like improperly used alliances with the Babylonian power, and they're opposed to like these other movements. And so it's just kind of interesting, to look at that, because you also see it like repeat in society where people don't know how to discern between freedoms that you should have, stages where if you know how to discern between improvements that you're making, then you're not just comparing and condemning people side by side for the same thing. You're looking at the context on a systemic level. And I think that's important because you see that play out in society as well, where people are politicized and they're trying to attack these certain movements, and they're kind of attacking the wrong group. And so it's very tricky because you actually find, so another part of the deception is that they can kind of construe the attack to be these other people. So going back to like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? It's such a deception of things that they masquerade as being the saviorism, being the conservative, proper alignment, honoring the system, honoring the success of the system. And then they kind of misconstrue the movement of those trying to discern between, stages of proper negotiation. And they pin them to target like other social movements. And so it's almost like saying they turn the movement to be against those seeking for reforms out of the occupying forces. So like the whole bottom half of the pyramid, they pin the spiritual movement against them, and in them attacking each other, they then let the system have its power, and then they partner in the top level of this dominion in the system to then pretend that they're saving different ones and picking and choosing between a saviorism because they're reigning at the top of this pyramid, because a lot of it is generated by how they've occupied groups, pinned them against each other, and then they falsify people fighting to be better situated in the investments of the dominant system. And so the dominant system, through deception, perpetuates itself, pins groups against each other, and they don't differentiate between the improper use of these things. You see that like in the political sides, like political parties fighting against each other, thinking that they're partnering with these groups to win certain societal freedoms. And a lot of these groups are all being occupied by these same types of power. So it's just a peculiar thing. So that's why I was saying it'd be interesting to try to sit down and draw that out. That's a lot to try to draw out though. But I guess, like I was saying, some of the imagery is the sense of these two different competing dominions, which is like represented in a different framework. Then also looking at the Maslow's hierarchy of needs as like mapping out how to control groups. And then like the bottom half is the occupied groups, and then the top half is those in the market functioning to have a power over different ones and falsifying and propagandizing what the solution in the repair is. Probably more to say, but I'll kind of leave it at that. I feel like forcing myself to try to articulate it, I do feel like I have, but that is like a lot to think about and could be very confusing. But hopefully it's somewhat clarifying. And so I'm going to leave it at that for now.